Pennsylvania has a long tradition of manufacturing centers. They called them ironworks, places where people came together to build things. This podcast is about building and sustaining our democracy. We call it Democracy Works.
Hello, I'm Michael Berkman, director of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. I'm here today with Chris Beam, the managing director, and we are very lucky today on Democracy Works to have as our guest Daniel Ziblatt, author of the bestselling book, How Democracies Die.
Yeah, in the biz, it's called a good get.
Chris, there's a lot to chew on in this book.
Yeah, it's a really impressive book.
Yeah, so where do we start?
Well, I can see this going two ways. The one thing is that, this book is one example of a number of books that are really responding to what is really a worldwide phenomenon about, people thinking that democracy is more under threat, more questionable as a way of organizing social life together than it has been in decades.
Right. I mean, the public really seems to have sort of woken up in really just over the past year, I think, to what it means to be a democracy and how democracies persevere, or even what I see as really a big takeaway from this book, the idea that democracies and something more authoritarian are not really dichotomies. You can get from one to the other.
And that is, I think, the real contribution of Daniel and Steven Levitsky, who's
his co-author.
co-author. Daniel studies Europe and Steven studies Latin America. And so they have a studied background in terms of how it is that democracies transcend and diminish into authoritarianism. And then they say, well, let's just look at this in terms of what's happening right now in the U.S.
Yeah, this idea that democracy can incrementally kind of be eaten away. And we're seeing lots of books about this now, coming from the right and the left, from all directions, interested in this idea. And they're not only looking to Europe and Latin America, they're also looking to America's own past. And I think it's really interesting what they're doing there, because I think Americans tend to think in terms of this country's constant growth towards becoming a more complete democracy.
Yeah, this expanding notion of what it means to say all men are created equal.
Yeah, exactly right. And what I think is so interesting about this moment right now, and why their book has been as successful as it has, beyond the fact that it's just beautifully researched and written, is that Americans are starting to think about this.
Well, I think you're right. There is this notion among, political scientists, among regular citizens, among everyone, that, we've been doing this for well over 200 years. We got it down. We know what we're doing. And we can assume that things are going to continue much the way they have.
One of the really nice contributions this book makes is that they offer sort of straightforward indicators to understand, for people to understand that you may have just elected an authoritarian.
Right.
Yeah.
what is important,
what do we need to pay attention
and what
to?
do you need to react the most strongly against? Right? It's not just, is it a rude tweet, or is there something else that really merits your concern and your considered response? And that is true for just about every step that the book identifies. In every case, Donald Trump has said things that move in the authoritarian direction, but so far there hasn't been any real actions that reflect that same kind of attitude.
Right. Should we all kind of sit back and enjoy the show and say it's really not that big a deal so long as things are continuing to operate pretty much according to law? Or is there really reason for concern in some of what's being said?
And this is probably a good spot on which to turn it over, because How Democracies Die spends at least as much time, if not more, on norms of behavior, on the idea that it doesn't just matter what you do, but how you do it and what your words convey. And so in that sense, and directly that issue, How Democracies Die reflects a very concerned and trepidatious tone about what's going on in America right now.
Well, let's bring in Jenna and Daniel.
Sounds good.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today on Democracy Works.
Yeah, thank you.
So your book, How Democracies Die, which you co-author with your Harvard colleague, Steven Levitsky. I'm curious if you could start off telling us about what the impetus was for you and Steven to write this book.
Yeah, well, Steve and I, we teach together. We've taught lots of courses together, graduate and undergraduate courses on democracies in crisis and democratic breakdown and democratization around the world. I work on Europe, and he works on Latin America. So we haven't primarily focused on the United States in our work. But during the course of the 2015-16 campaign season, really the Republican nomination process, we kept running into each other and talking about the tenor of the political rhetoric. And commenting how similar this was and how much it reminded us of politics and the countries we study. And so it was really that made us begin to think that there's something kind of unusual going on. And I think the real turning point came, I think it was in October 2016 at one of the debates when candidate Trump, when asked at one of the debates, would he accept the results of the election if he lost? And he said, well, I'm not so sure. I'll keep you in suspense. And it was really that moment where we realized this is not accepting the basic rules of the democratic game is something that non-Democrats do and that we had seen elsewhere. We'd never seen in the United States. And so we realized that we had something to say on this, drawing on lessons from other parts of the world.
And so where does Donald Trump fit into all of this? Is he... did this process of democratic erosion that you describe in the book, did it start before Trump, or was he kind of a symptom of it?
Yeah, so and it's a great question because in many ways I think there's a tendency to focus on Donald Trump. I mean, the spectacle of Trump and the latest offensive tweet or whatever people respond to. But really one of the points of our book is to say that these dynamics long preceded President Trump, that there's been a long-run process of polarization in American politics, really, we argue, driven initially primarily by the radicalization of the Republican Party, in which there's kind of growing polarization where people on opposite sides of the partisan divide have begun to fear each other in ways that, again, reminds us of other countries. But this preceded Donald Trump, and it'll outlast Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is in office till 2020 or leaves the office sooner, the implication of our book is really that these dynamics will still be there. And so it's those underlying problems that we could talk a lot more about that we think are really the thing that concern us.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned political parties, and so what role do you see parties playing in this process of democratic decline? I know you talk in the book about parties, their role as gatekeepers and how they might have stepped away from that in more recent years.
Yeah, so parties are really at the center of the story for us. One of the lessons from the book is that throughout American history, there's been around at least the 20th century, a period for which we have opinion poll data, there's been around 30% of the American electorate that supports kind of demagogic type of politicians. So, whether that's voters who supported Henry Ford, who had considered running for president in the 20s, or Huey Long, or Joe McCarthy, or George Wallace, there's a kind of continuous strand of voters that have basically had ambivalent views or not really strong commitments, we argue in the book, to democratic norms. So what's changed is not that voters have changed. What's changed is that the role of parties has changed. And so political parties in particular, before the 1970s, the way that parties selected candidates for the presidency was often in what critics at the time rightly called smoke-filled back rooms, where party leaders got together. And what's changed since then is the introduction of primaries, which is generally a good thing. I mean, this has made the selection of candidates much more democratic. But the downside of this is that it's made it much easier for a demagogic politician to come along and to gain the nomination of a party.
All right. And so what's the solution to that? How do you kind of prevent the same thing from happening again, or from these demagogues from winning elections?
So I mean, it's tricky. we don't advocate going back to the days of the smoke-filled room. That's certainly not the case. But there are kind of reforms around the edges that could make a difference. And in many ways, I think our presidential selection system is broken. And we've sort of known that for a long time, but it's been right in front of us, but it's only now become apparent after the 2016 election. And so one kind of thing that makes a difference and has made a difference and would make a difference is the existence of superdelegates. I mean, so the Democratic Party has superdelegates where elected officials have an extra say in the selection of presidential candidates. So in addition to voters, Democratic Party voters, the superdelegates at conventions have a say. And a lot of people are critical of this and think that we should get rid of this in the Democratic Party. But what's interesting is the Republican Party does not have superdelegates. This is a reform introduced in the early 1980s. Had the Republican Party had superdelegates, one wonders, what would have the results look like? Would have Donald Trump actually won the nomination? What if he run, and what if he won? So that's one kind of reform.
Yeah, it seems like maybe striking some type of compromise between the smoke-filled back room and more of a popularity contest type of thing.
Exactly.
Right. So something else that we've been talking a lot here about at the McCourtney Institute is the kind of constant assault from Washington on the free press. Can you talk a little bit more about what role you see that the kind of assault on the press playing from where you sit?
Yeah, so one of our chapters in our book, we lay out strategies that authoritarian inclined politicians have used around the world. And this is, again, drawing on lessons from other countries. And once in office, elected authoritarians often we kind of have a sports metaphor, and we say they try to capture the referees of the political system, so the court system, the neutral arbiters of rule and law. We say that they try to sideline the opposition. And we also say that one of the things they do is they go after the free press. I mean, this is a common thing, and it's often through very subtle means. It's not the shutting down of newspapers and media stations. So if one looks at what's happened in Turkey and what's happened in Hungary, I mean, although there's been some of that, kind of more extreme measures, one thing that has happened in a place like Hungary is that there's been a kind of process of licensing of media, changing of libel laws that make it easier to sue press journalists, and there's been a way in which the kind of control of the media has been politicized, and so that there's a kind of bias in the direction of the incumbents, all intended to kind of bolster up the incumbent. And in many instances, what happens is that the critical press is allowed to continue to exist. But what one sees is the kind of continued existence of a critical press is treated as part of the democratic opposition, and so becomes part of the problem of polarization. And so in many ways, the press becomes part of the game of politics, where each side is kind of viewing each other as enemy. And there's been increasingly critical views, more and more widespread views, saying that the press is out to get Donald Trump, or it's not giving President Trump a fair shake. And so I think it's hard to imagine, and similarly, sort of along the same lines, actually, Republican voters are increasingly critical and skeptical of the idea that elections are actually fair and free. So if you think that these two pillars of democracy, a free press and free elections, are regarded as significant portions of the population as being not legitimate, it's hard to imagine sustaining a viable democracy in the face of that. So it's very, very worrying.
One of the things that you hear kind of a counter argument to all of this is that Trump is all bluster, but no action behind that, and people on the left are kind of wringing their hands over nothing. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, so we have this in our book. We have this what we call an authoritarian litmus test, which are really a set of indicators attacking the media, questioning the legitimacy of elections, threatening violence or condoning violence. And these are all things that candidate Trump rhetorically embraced before the election. And so people have said, well, he hasn't done much in office. I mean, this has all been talk before the election. In office, he's been largely constrained. And whether one thinks that constraint is self-imposed or comes through our system of checks and balances, one can say, well, what really do we have to worry about? And I guess I have sort of two responses to this. I think the words matter, and words matter for two reasons. Number one, when President Trump attacks the media and says it's the enemy of the people, when he falsely says that there's rampant election fraud, that this shapes public opinion. The second way that words matter, though, is that they generate fear on the side of the Democratic opposition, the Democratic Party opposition. And this contributes to polarization. And so so there's great increasing temptation for people on the Democratic side of the aisle to use increasingly extreme measures if they feel that they're under assault. This can kind of give rise to a spiraling effect, a tit-for-tat effect, where one has both sides regarding each other in increasingly, frightful terms, and there's kind of fear and loathing across the political aisle. So I think the president has a particular responsibility to hold the line, and because people look to the president and believe the president, both his allies and his opponents, and so in this sense, language matters. So I think even if there was no actual institutional damage done, immediate action done, I think words matter very serious way.
So one of the things that struck me in the book was you talked about, I think it was Venezuela, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that there was a poll done after its democracy had gone away, and some astonishing number of people there still thought they were actually living in a democracy.
Right.
So
that's right. Yeah, it was Venezuela. That's right. Yeah, it's a frightening thing. I mean, I think that's one of the title of our book again is How Democracies Die, and when people often ask us, well, how do democracies die? And we say really they die in two different ways. I mean, during the Cold War, the primary way that democracies died was through these very vivid moments, singular moments of authoritarian coups or military coups. I mean, 3/4 of democratic breakdowns happened this way during the Cold War. Since the collapse of communism, though, given the existence of elections around the world and the kind of general, embrace of democracy around the world after the collapse of communism, the way that democracies collapse now is through elections. And so this often happens in a much more incremental way. And so it's very frightening. I mean, actually, I'm kind of reminded here of a quote from Ernest Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, a character in The Sun Also Rises was asked, so you went bankrupt. How did you go bankrupt? He said, I went bankrupt in two ways. First, very slowly, and then very quickly. And so I think a similar kind of story, unfortunately, can apply to democracies. That the kind of erosion of democracy does take place slowly, and so we need. And I think in many ways the U.S. is experiencing this, and so to prevent the moment of rapid collapse, I think we need to work very hard.
Right, because once you reach that point of rapid collapse, it's too late, right?
Yeah, and so and I think the way that this actually takes place is through this kind of spiraling effect where both sides view each other as enemies and neither side wants to compromise, and you kind of get into this death spiral where it's really hard to break out of. In many ways, I think all of us, including myself, have taken our own democracy for granted, and we've tended to think that politicians can act as reckless as they want and our institutions are strong. But I think that actually, you look around the world, that's really not the case. And so we really, again, part of the purpose of writing the book is to alert people to the basic fragility of our institutions.
So you also say in the book that democracy is grinding work, which kind of ties back to our whole theme of this podcast, Democracy Works. So can you talk a little bit more about what that phrase means to you, grinding work?
Yeah, so that's good. This is a question nobody's asked me before. So So there's this distinction. There's a great German sociologist, Max Weber, has this distinction between the politics of ultimate ends and the politics of responsibility. And the politics of ultimate ends, Weber says, what are your goals? What are your big visions in politics? And it's important to have big visions and big goals and high policy priorities. But politics is also just about behaving in responsible ways, democratic politics. And so in a way, it's a distinction between process and policy. And so what we think is that often one has to make compromises in politics, in process, in order to achieve one's goals. But what we think at the end of the day is that one has to remain committed to the process, and that one has to, forge alliances with people that one may disagree with on policy terms in order to defend democratic institutions. And so one of the points that we make is that, it's important for Democrats, for instance, who want to defend democratic institutions to reach out to people they may not normally think they reach out to. So kind of, I come from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's a solidly blue state. And when people think of their political allies, they think of the kind of usual suspects. But our point is that, in order for Democrats, that is, with a small d, Democrats who are patriots of democracy, they need to reach out to people they may disagree with, whether that's business leaders, evangelical Christians, again, groups that they may not normally think of as allies, but people who are committed to the democratic process. People need to kind of find strange bedfellows in a way to remain, who are committed to the process of democracy. And that's hard work. It's frustrating work. It's slow-moving work, and so I guess that's why I call it grinding work.
Right. Yeah, and it seems like in our instant gratification age, right,
Yes.
more and more difficult to achieve. So your book has been out now for several months. It's been on the bestseller list, and curious if you've heard of what feedback you've heard. Have you heard from any readers like, I read your book and I did this or I did that or taken action?
Yeah, quite a bit of that. I mean, both in public forums, so I've spoken in public libraries, and next month we're going to be speaking at the League of Women Voters, and so in public forum where citizens show up, and it's really been quite moving in a lot of ways. Citizens are extremely concerned, and I think in many ways it's reaffirmed my confidence in American political institutions, and in particular civic institutions, but also letters. We've gotten emails, letters, typed letters from people who obviously don't use email. Saying that this book has changed how I think about politics. And in some ways, I guess some of the more moving letters have come from teachers. We've gotten a lot of letters from high school and elementary school teachers saying, what should we be doing in the classroom to change how kids think about politics? And what do we do? And people often will say, how do we, in an era in which it's hard to even watch the news because of the kind of the stuff that gets covered in the news, but we want our children to be engaged in thinking about politics. How do we square these two things? And so, this is made me think that there really, this is the book. I mean, the book has found this resonance, I think, to a large degree because citizens are concerned. And again, I guess this partly gives me confidence that people aren't taking their democracy for granted, and I think people are sort of really interested in finding solutions. And so there's lots of new democratic activism across the United States, and so we found that very encouraging.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you've received letters and emails from teachers asking how they breach these topics. So what do you say to them? What's your response?
Well, it's I have to say I don't know. These are really hard issues. I think one of the things in writing this book that I've become more and more acutely aware of. I mean, I'm a political scientist, and I've always been interested in big institutions and institutional reforms, and you sort of think you can engineer institutions to generate better political outcomes. But I've become more and more convinced that there's a set of norms connected to democracy and a culture of democracy. And so on the last page of the book, we have this quote from E.B. White where he was asked in the 1940s, what is democracy? And he describes the sense of freedom that one feels in the public library and in the voting booth. And that's what I think what he's describing is a kind of cultural sense. And that it's a bit nostalgic because he's describing life, in the 1940s. But in a way, I think what our jobs, and I'm a teacher, so one of my jobs as an educator is to generate a sense of that for students. And I think in many ways, one of the things, one area that I think there's some interesting work being done is in teaching children how to deal with fake news. So this is not exactly right on your question, but so in my own father grew up in Maine in the 1940s, and he was telling me that in the 1940s, in the midst of the beginning of the Cold War and after having fought fascism, there was this incredible effort to teach children how to detect propaganda. And he still could remember from the 5th grade the kind of key hallmarks of propaganda. And that quickly kind of disappeared from the curriculum, kind of civics curriculum. But I think in many ways there's now lots of work being done, and people sort of trying to figure out how can we have our children in schools begin to develop the skills of active citizenry. And I think in a way we have taken this for granted for too long, and I think people are developing curricula and trying to think about this, and I think that's like a promising area of work.
Great. So we are going to conclude here by asking you some of our Mood of the Nation questions.
Okay.
So the McCourtney Institute runs the Mood of the Nation poll. It is a quarterly public opinion poll, but a little bit different from some of the other polls out there in that it is open-ended. Mm-hmm. So there are 4 questions that we always ask. I'm looking for your best tweetable responses here.
The pressure's on.
We'll start with pithy, and then you can expand there if needed. So, what about politics in America makes you angry?
I think when people can't even engage in debate and hear each other.
And then what about American politics makes you proud?
Citizens showing up to public libraries to discuss the future of democracy.
And what makes you worry?
Levels of distrust of, again, it's very similar to the first point, levels of distrust among citizens across the political aisle.
Right. And finally, we'll end on a positive note here. What gives you hope?
I think the anti-gun movement in the high schools in Florida. I mean, this is an incredible movement, again, where I think young people are really understand things that adults don't, and it's been really moving, and I think that this has the potential to have a transformative effect.
All right, great. Well, we'll leave it there. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right. Well, kudos to Jenna and to Daniel. That was a terrific interview.
Yes, Daniel, this is clearly not his first rodeo.
Not his first rodeo. And when you have a book on the New York Times bestseller list, you can expect that you're going to get some experience with doing interviews.
Yeah, a really interesting interview. Terrific book. So I'm not at all surprised. I was really struck by something he was talking about there when he was saying that words matter.
Right, which is a point that we made in the beginning, right? That this distinction between words and actions is not as bright as a lot of Republicans would like it to think it is.
Yeah, so just to pick up a little bit on what he was talking about with the media, because you and I have talked about this before, and we see a free oppositional press as critical,
right,
to a democracy.
Sine qua non, really.
And they do too. And one thing he was talking about a little bit was whether or not the president's threats against the media have really made, whether they've made a big difference or not. And he points out that that polls seem to show a large distrust of the media. We've picked this up too on our Mood of the Nation poll. And interestingly, I think we've picked it up in a way that shows really the impact of the Trump campaign. And that is to say, when we first started polling in 2015, we didn't then and we don't now ask about the media. We just say, what are you angry about in politics, as Daniel was asked. And Republicans never mentioned the media early on. They were angry at Obama and Hillary Clinton and lots of other things. But once Trump really started to talk about it, about fake news and attacking the media.
And we have numbers of people who trust the media or respect the media. It unheard of lows.
We're recording this as we're kind of entering into the primary season, and we have had candidates in multiple places not answer questions or deny stories based on the idea of the fake media.
It is, and not to mention the fact that other tin horn dictators around the world are picking up on this notion of fake news as a way of just kind of insulating themselves from criticism.
That's what we're seeing in some of these other campaigns right now. Don't worry about that news story from a local media source about something that I did or because it's just fake.
And I don't have to take it seriously.
Right.
I can just dismiss it out of hand.
And the groundwork's been laid for that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's why there's a First Amendment, because the founders understood that you couldn't sustain a democracy without it. Period, paragraph, right? I mean, it's the First Amendment.
Yeah. And so just to give a taste of really how interesting and timely this book is, we've been talking mostly about this issue of the media, which is just one small part of what they talk about as the indicators of authoritarian behavior. What I think they do so nicely in that book is to walk through each of these.
Right.
So I mentioned at the beginning that, it's really not that funny when we talk about locking up Hillary Clinton. And the reason it's not that funny is that democracies do not, delegitimize their opponents by calling them criminals.
And authoritarians do.
And it's one thing that, often Donald Trump seems to like to align himself with authoritarian leaders. And, I think a lot of that has to do with he tends to see himself in very strong sorts of terms. I mean, Donald Trump talks about strength a lot. He does not talk about democracy.
Yeah, and the one thing about this book, I mean, both you and I can wax emotional on some of these issues. But the thing about this book is it's measured. It's grounded in history and in a formidable knowledge of how this has happened and the terms by which they evaluate America right now, and especially the Trump presidency, are objective. Right? These are not like, and here's how we're going to trash Trump. That is not what's going on here. These categories, these litmus tests that they set up are meant to describe how any democracy moves into authoritarianism. So we have this book, a really good sense of what we should be looking for and what we should understand to be important and how we move forward. And that's kind of our job too in this podcast. So we're going to be looking at ways that people are talking about with respect to civic education and some other issues coming forward that are particularly designed to address this question of how do we sustain and rebuild norms going forward.
Yeah, looking forward to coming back to that in a future podcast. So everybody tune in. I mean, I think we've talked quite a bit about these kids down in Florida and some of what we can learn from them.
And obviously Daniel finds that very hopeful as well.
If the mood of the nation poll were in the field this week, I think we'd hear that answer a lot.
I think you're right, Nick.
Yeah, so go to iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. Like our podcast because that helps it spread
and
more.
We're on social media. Would love to hear from you. Love to hear what you think about this. What other things you'd like us to talk about?
Yeah, and some podcasts bring their dogs in here, but we're not going to do that.
Well, not yet. Well, I mean, we're going to tease that for at least a year before we actually do it.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
All right. Thanks for listening.